All right, guys. So let's go ahead and start chapter 8, the High Middle Ages or the Late Middle Ages. So, right at the start of a fresh page, please. Top of the page, chapter 8, the High Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are a long period of time. The Middle Ages are so long that we're going to break it into two chapters. Think about this. The Middle Ages roughly start in the year 500, just about AD, and they go till the year about 1500. Now, there's a huge difference. The first chapter 7, as we covered it, the world is in chaos and madness, and all these things are collapsing, and institutions are falling apart, and barbarians and Visigoths and Ostrogoths and Vandals and all these groups are coming in and attacking different parts of Europe. That we would call those first 500 or so years of the Middle Ages, we would call the Dark Ages. But now the High Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages, are much different, and so that's what we're going to cover today. Okay, so what I talked about way back in chapter 7 is Pope Gregory. There's only two popes I cover in this class, and Pope Gregory was important because when Rome collapsed, the only institution left that could help anyone was the church. And the church was mainly visible in most small towns. There'd be a church, and people were bringing orphan children that they would find, sick people, homeless. Um, they would go to the church to solve their problems. But the thing is, the church at that time, the Catholic Church's mandate was spiritual only. Pope Gregory stepped in and said, you know what, the church has to do more. The church has to step up. The church is going to have to be the ones who build orphanages and build um, places for the homeless or the sick or hospitals or universities so education's not destroyed in Europe, and they teach the secrets of agriculture, and they keep book learning alive, or they teach people literacy and all these things. But here's the thing, by doing this and by building armies and trying to protect parts of Europe, the church has left its spiritual mission and is now taking upon what's called a political mission, a secular mission, a worldly mission. And as I said back then, when the church gets involved with the world is going to get involved with the church, and this is where you start to get corruption for the like massive corruption in some instances. So you had some priests that were getting married, which is forbidden. You had them having babies, within their villages. But the two major problems are, one is called simony, and simony is when church officials would sell religious offices. And an office just means a job. And the job that people were most that people wanted the most was bishop, because bishop is basically like a minor prince or a prince of the church. They have incredible power within these small areas of the church. And imagine that you're a king and you have two sons, and your first son is going to inherit your throne. Well, what do you do with the second kid? You don't want them fighting over power. And sometimes kings would then bribe church officials, so when the current bishop dies, their son, who has nothing to do with the church, gets appointed bishop. And so that's called simony. That's selling religious jobs, and that's obviously a corruption and a no-no. Within the Catholic Church, bishops are appointed. That there's a lot of prayer and thought about that. Now, the second thing is called lay investiture. And this is where, out and out later, where kings would just appoint a bishop. They would just tell the church, we're going to appoint the next bishop. You're not going to decide that, which is crazy because that's totally political. Like, that is totally separate. But this would only happen when kings had a lot of power. They could do this. And I'll be honest, this is happening in the church today. This is what China does to the Catholic Church. China a few years ago told the church, if you want to be here and not be persecuted, you will let us appoint your bishops. And that's just lay investiture. Everything that is old is new again. It becomes pretty obvious to the church that there needs to be some type of reforming process. And so at this time, what the church does is it creates new orders. And one of them is the Dominican order, which, by the way, locally, we have a Dominican school, St. Gertrude's, and the Franciscan order, and we also have a Franciscan school nearby, and that's the St. Roger Bacon. And the reason why the church creates orders is to solve usually existing problems. So they're dealing with this issue of money and corruption and not focusing on the salvation enough. And so what these two orders really do is they focus on poverty, celibacy, getting away from worldly things, and they just travel and preach. And to give you an idea of what it's like, if you're a Franciscan even today, Franciscans take the vow of poverty. You're actually looking at modern Franciscans. They only wear robes, and oftentimes they wear sandals all year round. They're not to really own anything. And so the church starts to make a focus of getting away from wealth and riches and starts saying, no, no, no. The major thing we need to be concerned about is heaven. And so that's why these two orders are founded. Now, at this point in history, as the church gets more powerful and people start considering the role of God and faith in society, this idea of building these new churches, buildings, is created. And these churches are called cathedral. And the word cathedral literally translates to cities of God. And the earliest cathedrals, while they were very impressive, and they put a lot of resources into them. They're called Romanesque. But if you look at the building I have up on the screen right now, that's a Romanesque building. And if you look at it, it has kind of small windows. It's kind of heavy. It looks really like a prison or like a castle. And the reason for this is simple. This is all they knew to do. They don't know how to go beyond that. You can only construct architecture that you have the capacity of doing. And at this point in history, what they know how to build are fortresses. So you can always tell Romanesque style buildings by this, the fact that they're heavy, the walls are thick, the windows are small. If the window was too big, the building would collapse in on itself. And as you can see, generally speaking, Romanesque buildings only maybe 4 or 5 stories at most, like 40 feet. And you can look at that picture right there. It's a great example. So they start putting tremendous resources. Imagine how hard that building on the screen right now, how difficult it would be to build something like that with no modern equipment, no modern scaffolding, no tools, no vehicles. Here's another Romanesque building. If you take a look at it, see this one's a little bit more ornate. They've got that spiral glass in the center there, but even so, look how small it is. They've got that little tower to the left. Again, though, really only about 40 feet high. Look how heavy. Look, even the doorways are very small. Look at the windows. That building is beautiful, but look at the windows. They're tiny little slits. And again, these don't have the architecture to go beyond that. One more Romanesque building. Again, it looks a lot like a fortress. Look at that one out in the countryside. Look how, so that one has like a bit of a steeple, but again, small windows, heavy set building. This is Romanesque style in the Cincinnati area. Okay, so over time, this is the interior of the churches would look like this. If we're looking at a Romanesque, look how heavy those columns are. Look how wide the columns are. Look how relatively small the windows are. They don't let a lot of light in. There's actually a church in Hamilton, Ohio called St. Anne's. It was built in the early 20th century. It is Romanesque style. If you're to go in there, it's incredibly dark in the building. It's an incredibly dark building, and that's the point, though. Like, it doesn't let a lot of light in. It's heavy. It's got this. I almost to modern sensibilities, to me, it's a kind of a foreboding feel to it. Look at here's a Romanesque from the inside. It almost looks like a tomb, doesn't it? But that's actually a church. And here's another one. Okay, so but over time, as the Europeans get better at architecture, they start to create a new style, one that you guys have some familiarity with. It's called Gothic. And so about 500 of these buildings are created. The thing about Gothic architecture is some of these buildings took 600 years to make. So we're talking about generations of families working on these buildings, like father to son to son to grandson to great grandson, and so forth. These buildings, they start to construct new techniques to build them because look at the difference here with this building. See how high up the spires go into the sky? They're very ornate. The windows are gigantic. Now you start to see for the first time large stained glass windows, lots of points, decorations. You see gargoyles, anything ornate. Statues cover the buildings. And the other thing, and it's kind of obvious, is the buildings are very tall. And the way they do that is they create a new style called the flying buttress style. And the way flying buttresses work is they put these weighted columns up against the parts of the building, and those put pressure in, and they allow the building to go up even higher. So let's take a look at some of these. Look at that. Look how ornate that is. Look how that building is covered in sculpture, covered in decorations, spires going up into the sky. Look at the doorway. Look how large the glass is. These are all signs that you're looking at a Gothic building. Okay, so here's a good example of a Gothic building's interior. See all the stained glass, see the amount of light. Look at the ceiling. You've got these arch pointed ceilings that go up 20, 30, 40, 50 feet right up into the air. You can tell that Europeans are now getting better. They can put weight-bearing loads further up. The columns are able to hold more weight, so they're able to have fewer of them spread out more, which allows for more glass. Look how ornate the statues are. And they do the same with the exterior of the building. So look at this. This is the exterior of a Gothic building. You see all the crosses. You see all the different flourishes. Look at the giant stained glass there. Here's the interior. Look how beautiful that is. Look at the amount of work. Think about how long something like that would take to make. Just the level of detail put on, and the lighting that they put in. This is one small part of the altar of this Gothic church. And then you've seen these before, and this is where you get the idea of gargoyles, right? The idea of gargoyles. In medieval theology, they viewed the world a little differently. And gargoyle, the idea is that like something evil and fierce would actually keep evil away from the building. There's some very neat flourishes that they do with gargoyles. Sometimes they'll have like gutters going into the back of the gargoyle's head, so when it rains, water shoots out, and in the wintertime, ice is coming out. And here's that flying buttress that I mentioned. As you can see that there are these columns that go up that push weight in, which allows the center of the building to go up higher. And this is why you can always tell a Gothic building from a Romanesque just based on the height alone, not even looking at any other part, just the height on it alone. And that comes because of the flying buttresses, these stone supports that allow for thinner construction. All right. So as the Middle Ages progresses, a couple interesting things happen. One is a shift in the climate around the year 800. The little ice age ends. So basically, European climate was very cold for a very long time, and as the ice age starts to break, the climate starts warming. And the reason why we know this is if you look at a lot of the writings at this time, you could see that rivers were freezing very early in the year, like in October. But as the climate starts to warm, what happens is that people are able to start growing earlier in the year, and they're able to harvest later, which basically means people are able to produce more food. And that, to be fair, also really cold winters kill people. I mean, cold is very difficult to deal with. And so people start living longer. They have more access to food, more food's being produced just because the growing season's extended, and death from cold starts to reduce. At the exact same time, you get this other thing that happens. Europeans invent this thing called the three field system. And the three field system is very simple. What they're noticing is that the amount of crops they're producing are starting to become less and less on the fields that they have, which is horrifying. If you have like 5 miles of land and every year you're getting less food from it, you know that eventually in a generation or two, you're all going to be dead. Right? You won't be able to have any sustainable food from those areas. So there starts to be this concept that they have to start to revitalize the soil. And this is the system that they come up with. What they do is they split their lands into a set of three, A, B, and C. And on land A and B, they grow crops. But on the third spot, they don't grow anything. They leave it what's called fallow. They let it rest for an entire year. And on that part of the field, they let animals hang out, mate, rut, eat, defecate, do all the things that their animals can do all over that land. And by letting the land rest and by letting animals rut and do all the things that animals do, they're actually putting nutrients back in the soil. And so then the next year, that area becomes used and another spot gets used, and then they open up a blank spot, and that spot rests. And by doing this, they start to notice the soil is becoming rejuvenated, and they start to produce even more food again. And so, between the little ice age ending and the climate warming, and all of a sudden this shift in this technological shift in food growth, or a food production, you get this massive spike in food. And in history, gentlemen, if I haven't given you this formula, it's very simple. More food in history equals more babies. It's just the same. It's the same for any animal. The more of food available, the more calories available, you're going to get more. And all of a sudden, there starts to be a spike in European population numbers. So, this picture just gives you a quick indication of how the three field system might work. You've got field one, they've got wheat on there, field two, barley, and then the third field, they leave it fallow. That's where the animals are eating, defecating, mating, those types of things. So, just so you can see it. All right, section two, the plague. So, separate this. We're finally going to get into the Black Plague. So, just to give you an idea of how bad the Black Plague is, COVID, which killed, I think about maybe 1%, 1.17% of the people that it infected. The Black Plague kills on the low end 30%. And so, for the purpose of this class, that's the number you're going to know. But there's actually a lot of historians now that say it killed 60% of any people that come in contact with it. So, let's get into that. So, let's deal with the Black Plague. Okay, so the Black Plague strikes. In the 1300s, Europeans suffer what's called the bubonic plague. And that's the best guess. For the purposes of this class, and most historians say that the Black Plague is actually a disease called the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague had been around for a long time. The difficulty, and the reason why it's called the Black Plague, is they weren't 100% certain what was killing people and why it was killing them. They just know that this was an incredibly deadly disease, and the reason why they called it the Black Plague is, one, black is often a stand-in for death, but also, and I'll show you pictures, the disease, as it destroyed your body and necrotized the flesh, your hands and the extremities started to turn black as your flesh rotted on you. You'd also get these pustules that had some darkness around them as well. So let's get to it. So where does the Black Plague come from? The Black Plague actually originated in Asia, probably in China. And what happened at this time in history is that there's this group called the Mongols that were incredibly powerful. And they were so powerful, it creates this era of peace. And so there's not a lot of fighting in Asia. And there's this route that people take called the Silk Road. And basically, it's just as people move from Asia, they're able to move from Asia to Europe for the first time because there's not as much banditry, wars, conflicts. And as people move from Europe to Asia and Asia to Europe, they bring this disease with them. And so this disease, and now to have you write this down, roughly speaking, kills at least a third of Europeans. So 33% is the number. This video actually shows how quickly the Black Plague spreads. 1347, 1348, 1349, 1350, 1351, 1353. It is throughout Europe. Now, a lot of times students look at this slide and they always say, Mr. Rico, what's going on in like Krakow and Milan? Well, so in some areas, they had pretty brutal rulers who would not let people in and out of their cities. And if you were, even there was a hint that you were sick, they would actually bolt you into your house until you died. Didn't matter whether or not you had the plague. They would write, "Have God have mercy on your souls." In some cities, like Krakow in particular, they took a really strong stance against the plague. No one was allowed to enter. No one, if you thought you were sick, you're locked in your home till you die, and that kind of spared them from some of the major ravages of the plague. But you can also see how fast it moves. In just a few years, all of Europe has gotten the Black Plague or the Black Death. So let's get to it. Now, again, it's the nickname for it is the Black Death, and what we know now is really what it was is there's probably three different variations of the bubonic plague. So bubonic, you have things called buboes, and they're lymph nodes that are like here in your neck, your armpits, by your groin. And what the plague would do is it would target the buboes, and they would become infected and swollen to the point where they would stick out like an egg, or in some cases as big as an orange. And it would just become so filled up, the lymph node becomes so filled up with an infected material that periodically it would rupture and spray out. That's actually the best case scenario for you, because if you were to lance it, or it blows up and just sprays this smelly, gross, rotten, infected material out, then it's not in your body anymore. You had a much better chance of surviving. But so when you see the buboes, that's the bubonic plague. Well, the bubonic plague could also get into people's lungs. And if it got into your lungs, that is pneumocosis. Basically, at that point, the way it is now spread is that if you sneeze or cough, it goes airborne. It's aerosolized. And I would actually tell you the pneumonic plague was much more dangerous. The bubonic plague, say it has a 30% death rate. If it's pneumonic, you're at probably 60 some percent, because now it's in your lungs, it's in your respiratory system. The chances of you drowning in your own fluid now exists. And the most dangerous variation of the Black Plague was called the septicemic plague, and that means blood. Septa is blood. If the plague would invade your bloodstream and it goes throughout your body, there's almost no chance you would live. There's basically about a 95% chance of death. And to be fair, the same as today. When you get a septicemic infection, you're in a very dangerous state. Today we obviously have high-level antibiotics, and even then, still you can die from septicemia. But septicemic plague, almost certain death. So what causes the plague? This thing here is what causes the plague. Take a look at it. If you don't know what this is, good for you. You've never had these in your house. I had the misfortune of having this when I lived in California. And this is, of course, is a flea. Specifically, this is the oriental rat flea. What happened is, rats are disgusting animals. They're filthy, gross, garbage carrying, eating animals, and they root around in feces and everything else. And what would happen is rats would get the plague, but that's not an issue, right? Because I mean, how many people get bit by a rat? Not many people. The actual issue is that parasites like fleas would jump onto the rats to travel around. You get hundreds of fleas on one rat, and what they would do if the rat had the Black Death is they would bite the rat, and when all those fleas bite the rat and they're sucking blood from it, they now get the plague. And as the rats move around, the fleas jump off, and everything that flea, now those hundreds of fleas, whatever they bite, rats, horses, pigs, people, everything they bite will now get the plague. And so it spreads like a wildfire. Right? And the other thing you should know about Europeans at this time in history is Europeans, even by historical standards, were filthy people. Europeans slept with their animals, and for warmth and actually keep the animals safe, they would actually bring pigs into their houses with them, sometimes where they slept, because they wanted to keep the animal alive through the winter. And the positive side for Europeans is they had incredibly strong immune systems, because they were constantly spreading disease back and forth between the animals and the people, and the people and the animals, back and forth. There's a huge downside to this, though, because when you have an animal-borne illness, or a parasite-borne illness in this case, you're sitting on top of the animals. And so as the plagues start to spread, they spread to humans, and now the fleas that bite that human, now they get it, and it just spreads like wildfire. And the thing is, the humans don't know what's causing it. So people in Europe freak out. They think that witches are causing it, or there's a theory called that they believe that Jews were poisoning the wells. There's a theory called the miasmatic theory. Some people believe there are poisonous vapors coming up out of the ground that's causing it. They're evil vapors. If you smell it, you get it. There's a theory that there was a planetary alignment right as it started. They thought maybe that caused some type of divine thing, but they have no idea, because they don't have germ theory. So they have to just guess. All they know is people are getting something. It's spreading quickly. Blood is shooting out of their mouths. Giant buboes are sticking up. Rotten flesh is coming off. People's fingers and toes are rotting on their bodies. They're suffering from necrosis. There's horrible death. It's hitting whole families at once, and they don't know what's causing it. So that's a real quick picture of the cycle of the plague. Flea drinks blood. It gets sick. It bites a human. The human's infected. More fleas bite that human. They jump on a rat. They bite the rat, and it spreads around and around and around and around. Just to show you so you get the infection. You'd often be accompanied by a high fever. You could see in that they're showing a part of his hand. That's the Black Death, right? That's the Black Death part where you start to see their fingers start to necrotize and their flesh starts to rot off. You see the pneumonic part. That guy's got uh, pneumocnosis, where it gets in his lungs and parts of his body are swelling. Okay, so this is the reality of what plague actually looks like. So here it is. You can see this person suffering from plague. The bottom picture too, where it's like you can see they're starting to rot, their flesh, their capillaries are rupturing, their fingers are rotting off. You can see bone and flesh, and almost the flesh is like almost like parts of the body are liquefying under it, because what's happening is the blood vessels rupture, they no longer get more blood flow, and they just start to rot on the person. This is where they get that name, the Black Death, from. And to be fair, it's the Black Plague's not totally just gone. Like, the bubonic plague still exists periodically in America. I'd say maybe once or twice a year. If you pay attention to the news, some kid will get bit by a raccoon out in Colorado or New Mexico, and they won't get it treated, and all of a sudden they'll die of the bubonic plague. It happened last year. A high schooler died from plague. Now, people are, they know how to treat it. They'll hit you with antibiotics, and a lot of times they just cull every animal in the area. Like if a raccoon caused it, they'll just kill all the raccoons in that area to try to slow down the spread. A couple years ago in Madagascar, that large island right off of Africa, Black Plague broke out, and the world was terrified that the plague would get into Africa, who does not have the strongest healthcare system. Imagine the plague ripping through Africa and all the animals in Africa, the zebras and giraffes, and there's 1 billion people in Africa, but they were able to contain it in Madagascar, luckily. There was an estimate of how much damage the plague would do in the United States. See early plague symptoms there, septicemic plagues. It's taking that guy's foot. And yeah, you see these stories every year. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, and I have 2 awesome videos. I'm not going to play them here. You should play the 2 videos. So what do you do when you have a disease or a thing you don't even know? They don't know what it is. It's just killing people. What do you do? So villages would often hire what are called plague doctors, and I have a mask obviously in the room for this. A plague doctor, and there's the image. It was someone who'd have like this beak-like mask on, and the reason why is they'd have different oils or flowers in the tip of the nose, and that makes sense because remember they think the miasmatic theory that there are evil vapors causing it. Therefore, if you can't smell the vapors because it's going through rose smell, then you'll be better off. They would wear goggles so things couldn't get through that. They'd wear full clothing and leather gloves, and they'd have a metal rod so they could interact with the bodies. Plague doctors are often shown in like movies and video games as like being evil. They were actually people that were trying to help people. They had no idea. Imagine being sent into an area and have no idea what's killing people, but your job is to still save lives. And that's the reality of what's occurring here. So they would send these people in, and they would interact with the bodies through the rods. They would, as I put here, they would help infected people to the best of their ability. They would record deaths and infections, and they'd perform autopsies. And the reality is the plague doctor's outfit is good for immediate protection, but they didn't know it was fleas because, of course, fleas can just jump onto their clothing, and then later when they take that home, they can jump off and bite them and infect them with the plague. So there they are. That's a plague doctor. Definitely watch both videos. So let's talk about the effects of the plague in Europe overall. So what are the effects? Not all effects. You can have terrible things with good effects and good things with terrible effects. That's just the way history is. So here's what happens. The plague caused town populations to fall. Some entire towns, whole families were killed by the plague once it got going. Whole towns were just destroyed. The church loses a lot of prestige. People are going to the church for help, but that doesn't change the outcome of the plague. So for the first time since the Middle Ages it started, the church starts to lose some of that respect that it has. Trade declines because there's no one to trade with. In order for economic systems to work and you're trying to exchange goods and services. If you go to a blacksmith but he's dead and all the people he's trained are dead, you're not going to get that service. And if you have goods like apples or whatever, but you've got no laborers to pick them from the fields, you cannot do it. So under circumstances like this, trade just collapses. And once established trade routes fall apart, you can't just build them up again. You need to find an interlocutor, somebody who you can work with. That could take years. And so goods stop going from place to place. People stop teaching trades. What happens when all the blacksmiths in a town die? Who becomes a blacksmith? How do you get a blacksmith or a stonemason or someone who carves elaborate wood or makes clothing or a tailor or a baker? When those people die, they take what's called the human capital with them. All their knowledge goes right with them. And so that's a part of the whole economic collapse. Serfs and people on manors start to leave. The feudal system works awesome in that you don't want to leave the feudal manor because you're afraid of what's out in the world, right? You're afraid of all the terrible things, but it's really hard to keep people on a feudal manor when on the manors they're dying at the exact same rate as people off the manors. So people realize, well, what am I afraid of? I might as well just leave. And the other thing about it is, as people die off, you have to start paying people higher wages. The same thing happened after COVID. I remember a student asked me, Mr. Rico, can you make predictions about what's going to happen after COVID? The only prediction I really made, and I knew this to be true, I said, when this is over, they're going to have to pay, minimum wage is going to go up. And it always does. When you have less laborers, you have to pay the existing ones. So part of the feudal system starts to collapse because people say, well, I said I'm leaving because they're paying people a ton of money just to do very basic jobs. And you get a little bit less invasions too because people don't want to be subjugated to or subjected to the diseases of another culture. So feudalism starts to break down. All right, section 3, the Crusades. So put a section 3, the Crusades. On here, a very simple note. The Crusades, historically, have always been viewed as defensive wars. I know in modern sense, people think of the Crusades as these massive attempts to take over foreign lands. That's how it's been built. But historically, that's not how the Crusades are viewed because the lands that were taken during the Crusades were already Christian, and then the Christians are thrown out. So let's get to this rather uh, controversial topic. Okay, so here's what you need to know. To understand the Crusades make no sense unless you look at this map. This map tells you the story of what's happening in Europe. All the red spots on that's there it is. You see Spain and Italy and Sicily, and you see France, and you see Romania, you see Greece, North Africa, the Middle East. All those red dots are Christians being attacked by Muslims. Islam is a new religion around the year 600, and from around the time that Islam starts, Islam is a proselytizing, which means a faith that wants to spread itself, religion, but many of the tribes who convert to Islam are warrior tribes. So how do warriors spread a faith? They do it through war. And within 100 years, they're already deep into Europe. But by the year 700, Islam is already moving into Europe. That's why the Battle of Tours happens. They take over all of North Africa. The Christians were there. They take over the Middle East. The Christians were there. They throw them out. They take over the entire Iberian Peninsula. Look, there see Spain and Portugal gone. Then they go into France and Italy and South Italy and Sicily and Greece. And at some point, Christianity either has to do something or it's going to fall. Europe is going to break. That was why when I covered the Battle of Tours, it's so significant. It's really the first time that the Christians put a halt on the spread of Islam into Europe. Without the Battle of Tours, Europe falls. And so what the Crusades are a response to about 300 to 400 attacks by Islam against your Christians. So just to go over this a little bit. So I put 200 times. It's probably 300 to 400 times realistically. Christian kingdoms are being under constant attack by Islamic forces. And here's the other pope that I'm going to cover in this class. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II launches the First Crusade. There are 3 goals to the Crusades. There are 3 goals. And then what you would do then is you would say, well, okay, when we're done with this, you want to say, did the goals get met? Because I will tell you if the Crusades are successful. Goal 1 is to reclaim Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the Holy Land where Jesus was born and did his ministry, and it's a very holy place for the three Abrahamic religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So all three faiths, that area matters. The Christians have been thrown out. They can't even do pilgrimages to Jerusalem anymore, and they want to go back. They want to take that land back from Islam. So that's goal one. Goal two is to unite the Christian empires. Now, we haven't covered this yet, and I will. Christianity in the splits in the year 1054. It's called the Great Schism. There's two major branches of Christianity. There's Catholicism and the Orthodox faith. And the idea is that if these two parts of Christianity can come back together, Christianity can become powerful and repulse and push Islam back. And the third is to stop the Muslim advance into Europe. And this is just a fact. I mean, Islam is rolling right into Europe. It goes right into Spain, Portugal, conquers them, goes into Aquitaine and Gascony, and is going into France, and they have to stop them at the Battle of Tours. And so, like, at some point, and all of Eastern Europe is under constant attack. I mean, Romania, Prague, they're being hit continually. And the idea is, can we stop this? And so, when the Crusades happen, the First Crusade is very successful. It's in the year 1099. Christians recaptured Jerusalem. This will be the high point of the Crusades. This is the most successful part in the year 1099. So within 4 years, the Christians take it back. Now, so on the Islamic side, there's a guy named Saladin who's a pretty powerful warrior. He's from a tribe called the Seljuks. The Seljuks converted to Christianity, and the Seljuks were such renowned, powerful fighters that people would actually kidnap their children from a young age to raise them to become bodyguards for royalty. There was just a belief that the Seljuks were so intrinsically powerful that even just kidnapping a child and raising them, they would make a great bodyguard. Well, this tribe, who is a warrior tribe, converts to Islam, and they start pressing against Christianity. And Saladin confronts the Crusaders, and by the year 1187, he retakes Jerusalem for the Muslims. And so at that point, they sign a truce. And so Christians weren't even able to hold the Holy Land for 100 years. Now, there's a bunch of other crusades, depending on how you count them. Some of them are totally feckless and useless and absurd. There was the Children's Crusade, where like 20,000 kids start marching towards the Holy Land until they're all captured and sold into slavery. There's a Drunkard's Crusade. The Crusades, as they go, get less and less organized. And there's atrocities committed every which way during the Crusades, which occurs in wars. But really, the one that was truly successful for retaking Jerusalem was the First Crusade. So how do we deal with the Crusades as a historic event? So what we would do is we would look at the Crusades and say, what was the objective and was it met? There were three major goals. Remember, one is to reclaim Jerusalem. Did they do that? No, they failed. They only held it for 100 years. Two, did they unite the Christian empires? No. Actually, during the Crusades, at multiple times, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church actually come into conflict and they attack each other. And three, did they stop the Muslim advance in Europe? Absolutely a success. Islam was pressing Europe from all sides. And I don't even think it's historically controversial to say that Europe would have totally collapsed under Islam's assault. But the thing is, by doing the Crusades and now targeting the Holy Land, it actually starts the fighting in the Middle East. It pushes the fighting, and a lot of the Islamic warriors, it forces them to fight in the Middle East and not in the heart of Europe. So this is the complexity of the Crusades. Anybody who says, oh, the Crusades are simple and they're this or that, they're really not. And the thing is, unless you want Europe to fall to Islam, you kind of need the Crusades. You kind of have to have them to push the battles off out of Spain, out of Portugal, out of Sicily, out of Italy, out of Romania, out of Prague. You're going to have to do that. And so now, mind you, any war that you're in, a lot of innocent people are going to be killed. And that's the thing about wars. Lots of people are dying. There's a lot of atrocities that occur. The last part I want to talk about regarding the Crusades is the ramifications afterwards. Spain, which was conquered in the year 700 by Islam, then spends the next almost 800 years fighting to get their culture back. And so who took over Spain? These North African Islamic tribe called the Moors jumped from North Africa into Spain, and that makes sense given that Spain is a very small distance from Africa. If you look on the map, there's just a small slice of blue in between them. And so the Moors attack Spain, they conquer Portugal, they conquer the Iberian Peninsula, and for the next 800 years, Spanish Christians fight to get their culture back. And this is called the Reconquista, right? The reconquer. And they actually pull it off. You know, I always find it interesting, like in our culture, like everyone gets upset when whatever the opposing political party that they believe in take the White House for 4 or 8 years. But the Spanish fought for 800 years to get their culture back. And in the year 1492, they got it back. This is significant. And I always tell people in history there are no coincidences because all of you have heard the year 1492 before. You've heard this jingle. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. There's no coincidence there. And it happens, one happens because of the other. Once the Spanish finally reconquer their nation in 1492, they no longer have to spend as much money on the military. So now they have extra money to put towards things like explorers. And now they invest in a guy named Christopher Columbus who discovers the New World. You do not get Europe discovering the New World without the Reconquista ending when it does. One thing leads to another. All of these things matter. It's just one of those moments in history. I think someone once said there are no coincidences. And so we call that the Reconquista, the ending of the Muslim rule inside Spain. Um, Shortly after then, you get this thing called the Inquisition. And the Inquisition, and the idea of the Inquisition is to push all the non-Muslims and non-Christians out of Spain. And what that is it's a court, right? It's a court to suppress heresy and expel all these non-Christians out. And in some cases, they do that in some pretty brutal ways. So I think the records I read is up to 6,000 people were tortured during this time. You would have the option to leave Spain. So Spain's trying to purify itself. You could either be exiled or you could convert, or that would result in your torture or death. The guy on the screen right now, by the way, his name is Torquemada. He was the Grand Inquisitor during this time period. Not necessarily a very nice man. So thousands are killed or exiled. Okay, so I'm not gonna go too much on this. I'll do this in class, but I have a video here. It talks about medieval torture during the Middle Ages. You know, we always think that people today are so savage and so brutal. We really don't hold a candle towards the people of the past. The more savage and closer your civilization is to death, the more violent generally your civilization is. In the Middle Ages, they're much closer to collapse and death, and so some of the devices and the methods that they use are pretty brutal. The one on the screen right now is called the Judas cradle, where someone would be suspended in midair and they'd be put on that pyramid, and over time the way the pyramid would send the spike into their colon and up into their digestive system eventually. That's actually a Judas cradle. This is the breaking wheel where people would the wheel they'd be tied to the wheel and they would be dunked, or parts of their body would be burned through steam or fire. Or there's another variation where part of you is tied to the wheel and part of you is not on the wheel, and they would crank the wheel and separate you. I forget the name of this chair, but again, it's the same concept of the Judas cradle, where you just let the chair, the weight of the gravity, eventually impales them onto the spikes. This is perhaps one of the most well-known torture devices from Europe, certainly from Germany, and that is, of course, the Iron Maiden, and it is basically a sarcophagus that looks like a woman with different spikes, and the shortest spike is the one that goes into your heart, and basically as it slowly shuts, the spikes enter different parts of your body, with only the last one killing you. Last thing I'm going to cover, I'm not going to spend too much about. This is called the pair of agony. The pair of agony was a device that you would shove into a person's orifice. You would turn the crank, and you could spin it, and you would core the person out, and that can go into different parts of their body. So where do countries come from? How do you go from just being like a tribe or a people who live in an area to a distinct nation? That takes time. It happens over long periods of time. And specifically, what we're going to talk about is where that came from for England and France. Um, so, England, of course, the island right here in the image that you're looking at, England, the island, Britain, the island right next to the continent of Europe. England has always had this waterway in between them, which separates them, which can slow down invasion. But in the year 1066, the current king of England at that time of Britain is named Harold II. And Harold controls, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, that area. And what happens is a guy in France named the Duke of Normandy, his name is William, decides to go across the channel and invade. It's actually a very difficult thing to pull off, but Harold has to actually fight in two battles in 2 days. One, he has to fight at this Battle of York, which he does. He goes up there. That's the first invasion point, and he defeats that army. Then he has to immediately take his army and go south and fight at the Battle of Hastings against William directly. And during the battle, Harold gets an arrow to the eyeball and he loses, and William takes over. And the reason why this matters is because this inextricably links England, France, together in a series of conflicts, which creates like a rivalry. And they're at times they're like friends, and other times they're enemies. They're frenemies, as you might say. But it also, what it does is the fact that England is invaded inextricably links England to the continent of Europe. Moving from this point, the year 1000 to the present, England is connected to Europe. It's a part of Europe. They're not, that little waterway, the channel is not so great that they're not a part of the same place. And there's going to be a lot of rivalries and wars and fighting done there. So think of it. One last note about the Battle of Hastings and why it matters is that a king of France, basically, a Duke of France, rather, Duke took over England. And so now that there's going to be claims to each throne, like at times the English are going to be claiming the French throne, and the French are going to be claiming the English throne. And there's going to be all this political intrigue, and people are going to send their kids back and forth to marry each other, and it's going to create a lot of conflicts moving forward. So this is the Battle of Hastings. And one last thing about the Battle of Hastings: this is the last time England has successfully been invaded, all the way to the present. So from the year 1066, from moving forward, what England's really going to do at times to protect itself is it's going to have a powerful navy. Because really a navy is what you require if you want to prevent invasions. France and English are going in very different directions, and if you get a chance, watch the video that's linked to this slide. What happens in around the year 1215 is that in both England and France, they have these super powerful monarchs, and we would call them absolute rulers or absolute monarchs. And basically, over time, the kings have all power of their governments. They're the executive, they're the judicial, they decide what laws are and how to interpret them, they create the laws, and they enforce the laws. And they're so powerful that they rule their governments with an iron hand. But what eventually happens in England, and this is a really important point in history, and this leads directly, eventually to the American Revolution. Like, you can't have an American Revolution without this moment in history. What happens is the English nobles, not the peasants, the nobles, the people with titles, get so sick of the abuses of government, specifically King John. What they do is they threaten him with an army. They get this army together called the Army of God, and they tell King John, "You have to give us rights." And so, what are some of the abuses that are occurring that make them so angry? One, if a noble person dies, the king can just remarry that noble person's wife to anybody they want, and they'll take all their property. He can raise taxes without asking people's permission. He can just raise taxes at any time. He can put people in jail. He could say, "Hey, you committed a crime," and before any type of trial occurs, they could just leave you in jail in for an indeterminate amount of time. So say, yeah, you stole something, and I'm going to leave you in jail waiting for your trial for the next 50 years. Now, if you notice, a lot of these things our Constitution, the very first, the Bill of Rights, deals with all of these because these are common concerns. So when the nobles bring this to King John says, "Yeah, no, I'm an absolute ruler. You buzz off." And what the nobles do is they raise this army called the Army of God, and they say, "King John, you're going to give us rights, and if you don't, we're going to murder you." And at that point, King John signs this document. It says it's called the Magna Carta, which means Great Charter. And so this is really the first time in history you see an absolute monarch, their power taken away. The king now has to go through the nobles. They have to they have to agree to things like being taxed. Now, the vast majority of people in England are not nobles. They're regular people. They're like us. They're the peasants. They're the regular people that do the living and the working and the fighting and and paying the taxes. But here's the thing: once you've established that a king can't do or queen can't do whatever they want, these rights are eventually going to bleed down to regular people. So in 1215, yeah, when he signs the Magna Carta, it only gives the noble class these rights, but over time, eventually regular folks are going to be guaranteed rights like trial by jury. So that's why the Magna Carta is significant, and that is why it's eventually going to lead to the founding of America. This idea that we have rights that are separated from government. The government's job is actually to protect them. It's not to, the government doesn't give us our rights. The rights come from outside the government, and the government's job is to protect them. That all really goes back to this, the Magna Carta. Okay, so now what happens? So that was 1215, the Magna Carta's creation. In 1295, you get this thing called Parliament. Now, so what Parliament is it's a legislative body. It's much like if you think of the Senate in Rome, who wrote the laws. But the difference is, and this is very clever, and this actually speaks to our system. And again, anyone who writes the laws for a part of government, that part of the government is called the legislature. Parliament is broken into two parts. It's called a bicameral chamber. There's an upper house and a lower house. The upper house is the more elite house, and then there's a lower house. And this is a lot like our Congress. And this is actually where we get the idea from. The upper house, the more elites, are the House of Lords. And so they're people who would have, there'd be aristocrats, right? People with titles and power and land. And then you'd have the House of Commons, where more regular people would be in there. And so in order to pass a law, you actually have to go through the House of Commons and then the House of Lords. This is just like how our Congress works, right? We have our House of Representatives, which is like the lower house. It's not very impressive. People in the House of Representatives are paid a lot less than the Senate. People in the House of Representatives have to run for re-election every 2 years, so they're constantly running for re-election, constantly, because it takes a year to run for an election. So by the time they finish one election, they're running for the next one. And the reason why is simple, because the House of Representatives is very close to the people. If you're going to get reelected, you have to be listening to your people. The upper chamber for us is called the Senate, and that's their House of Lords. And our Senate, they have 6-year terms, so they don't have to necessarily listen to their constituents as much. They can make more long-term decisions. And the point is the two bodies have to work together. And this idea that we utilize in our country comes from Parliament. And so now, in just 80 years after the Magna Carta, you now see that the king is no longer in charge of making laws, right? There's an outside group that is in charge of laws. And eventually this is going to lead to the third branch, which is the judiciary, judges who interpret the laws. So you can see this all happening. The power of the nobles are growing. The power of the king inside of Britain is shrinking over time. Now, so what happens in France? France actually goes in the exact opposite direction. Their rulers become insanely powerful. Their kings become hyper powerful. You get some of the most powerful rulers ever in the history of the world. So, but they have kind of a system that is similar to a legislature. And so the way this works is it's called the Estates General. And the Estates General is a body of three groups of people in France. They have the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. And these three groups come together to vote. And if two of the groups agree, then whatever their idea then will be pushed forward to the king to make a decision about. And so the first estate and is the clergy, the second estate is the nobles, and the third estate is everybody else. In the third estate in France, this is the regular people, this is the peasants. This is like 97%, 98% or so of the population. This is the vast majority of the people are in the third estate. But the thing is, the first and the second estate work together in France, so they always ignore the third estate. And the king is much closer tied to the first and second estate in France. So the Estates General is just really a tool of the king to utilize. Like it kind of gives the people a feel that they're getting what they want, but the majority of French people are totally ignored because the Estates General, the way it's set up, really it gives preference to the first and second estates, which are more tied to the king. So we should go over these now so you have them. And again, the estates general, the first estate are the clergy. When we talk about clergy, we're not talking about like priests and nuns. Priests and nuns at this time in history were incredibly poor. They would be really a part of the third estate. They're poor people, they're the regular people. If anything, a lot of times they would have less. So, what do I mean by clergy? I generally mean bishops and cardinals. Very powerful people within the church would be in the first estate. And the thing about it, the privilege of being in the first estate inside of France is you basically paid no taxes. And that's a huge benefit, as you probably realize if you go to the store and buy things, what that means to not have to pay taxes. The second estate are the nobility. Now, so what is a noble person? I think in America we struggle with this a little bit because we don't have like nobility. The closest thing we have are like the Kardashians and celebrity sports players. But what nobility are people with titles. And so what does that mean? You would get a title like royalty, like a king or a queen could confer a title upon your family, and then that title would be passed on to your children. This is where we get words like duke and duchess, baron and baroness. This matters a lot because you'd be basically separated and you'd be given privileges that the regular people would not have. And one of those privileges again is no paying of taxes. The first and second estate in France own a larger proportion of land than they should because we're only looking at like 2 to 3, at most 4% of the population, and they own a large percentage of the land, which also irritates people. The last group is the third estate, and this is the peasants. And so this is the regular people. A lot of these people are poor. Not all of them are. There are some people who, like maybe a merchant or a doctor or a lawyer, would not be in the poverty class. But so this is the regular people who are not in the clergy. They're not aristocrats. So, wars often define civilizations and change history. And so, we're going to go over this war, the Hundred Years' War, which is kind of a misnomer because if you look at the years I put up there, 1337 to 1453, the Hundred Years' War lasts longer than 100 years. So, this is France and England. They're constantly picking at each other, constantly causing problems for each other, constantly claiming each other's thrones. They sometimes marry into each other's families and they do a lot of bloodshed. And so you could almost say this is a minor world war because it doesn't just include France and England. They do grab a lot of the other European powers and they ally with them and they go at each other. Now, they're both claiming each other's thrones, and why does this matter? There's a couple major effects of the Hundred Years' War. First of all, it happens, I would say at this point, Europe has really started to improve a lot. Like at this point in history, we're near the end of the Middle Ages, and things that were really on the ascension for Europe. Things were going well, economies were strong. This starts before the Black Plague. Things are going pretty good in Europe at this time. And when this happens, it causes constant strife in Europe, lots of warfare, a lot of death. And what it really does is it starts to congeal. It starts to bring together who's who. And what I mean by that is, here's the thing. Everyone in England is not necessarily like, oh, we're English people. No, they're people living in a territory. But the thing is, if you fight an enemy for 100 years, over time what happens is you say, well, there's the enemy. That's them. Well, if that's them, then who are we? This is us, and it starts to impart upon the English and the French that we are our own distinctive people, and much of that is concentrated by the fact that we have an enemy that wants to destroy us. And the same thing happens to the French. You start to get these early like flickers of what nationalism is. Like I'm a Frenchman, those are Englishmen, and they're different than us, and that they're about this and we're about this. The other thing I would tell you that really is significant about the Hundred Years' War is this is really the end of the Middle Ages. We're so close to the end of the Middle Ages, and the way you can tell that is one of the most important weapons of the Middle Ages is no more. During this war, the most prominent, most powerful weapon of the Middle Ages is put to an end. And that weapon is the knight. During especially the early Middle Ages, we talked about this in chapter 7, knights, these men who were trained from oftentimes the age of 7 as squires. They learned how to utilize horses and heavy armor, and they often knew how to fight with multiple types of weapon, lances, blunt weapons, daggers, swords. They used a heavy shield. They were basically the tanks of the early Middle Ages. A knight, and think about how much resources and money it would cost to have a man maintain a large, powerful horse that had to be fed and cared for daily. And by the way, that armor, which would probably have cost years worth of people's salary. And don't forget, you need a shield. And shields and armor have to be maintained and oiled and taken care of as well. All of that, all the resources that went into knights because they were game changers on the battlefield. When knights charged and hit enemy formations, it would break them up and shatter them. Well, during the Hundred Years' War, France has the early advantage because France has lots more knights than the English do. But the English develop a new type of bow, and it's called the English longbow. And if I was to show it to you, the English longbow, you can look in that one image. The English longbow is a bow that's 6 feet tall. It's a huge bow and requires a ton of power to pull back. Doesn't require a lot of skill, though. It requires power. And the reason why I would say it doesn't take a lot of skill is like if you're imagining that someone fires an arrow at someone running down a field and it just happens to clip them, that's not how it works. What you would do is you'd put together dozens, if not hundreds of men with the English longbow. They'd be on a line, they'd pull their bows back, and they would fire into the sky, and you would just throw down hundreds of these arrows on top of people. And the reason why it matters is the English longbow is able to pierce steel. This longbow, which can be fired by a peasant, a guy who has very little training, can kill someone who's been training for literally decades. And they have a horse that's worth a ton of money. And so now the English start crushing the French. Because what France had depended on to win this large population with heavily armored knights are getting slaughtered. Battle after battle. The French are losing. And think about how painful that is as a society. You put all this resources and wealth and time into training a guy, and he's killed by a peasant who just happens to be strong enough to fire an arrow. And so this really becomes the end of the knight as a main battle, a main weapon of war, we would say. You'll still see some knights moving forward, but they're no longer the main thing that you rely on to win the battle. So all that happens, and we've talked about this in the past in history. We've talked about like when we talked about Philip of Macedon changing the phalanx. All of a sudden, all warfare is different, and the English longbow is one of those things. All warfare will be different moving forward. So we're getting near the end of this unit, and I would go ahead and we're going to end with, well, so what happens to the French, right? They get whipped by the English in a lot of these battles. The French are losing. The French should probably have lost the Hundred Years' War. But what happens is one of these crazy things in history where this young lady named Joan of Arc, Arc is where, naming where she's from, keep in mind what a medieval battlefield looked like. A medieval battlefield is a battlefield filled with men, often large, powerful men. Many of them have been trained for a long period of time. This young French peasant girl believes that she's had a vision of the saints, particularly Saint Michael the Archangel comes down to her and says, Joan, I need you to fight to save your nation from losing. And Joan goes and talks to the local duke who's in her area, and she convinces him of her vision. And think about how hard that would be. This is a child. This is a young girl telling, a teenager telling a duke that God has come to her and is telling that, and he has a message, and that she needs to fight on the battlefield. The duke is so convinced, he suits her up, puts her in with a unit, and she leads medieval armored men into battle, and she starts winning. And specifically, there's this battle called the Battle of Orleans. And at the Battle of Orleans, the French win, which really prevents, like, the war was going so poorly that you started to get this, like, just one after another, almost like an avalanche of bad news. But not at this battle. Joan of Arc, with her men, defeat the English. So what happens to Joan? Like, we could pretty much give her credit for creating the draw that ended up being the Hundred Years' War. Well, Joan is captured by the English, and for whatever political reasons, the French do not work hard to get her back, and the English burn her, saying that she's a witch. But this young teenage girl with a message from God changes all of European history by leading men into battle victoriously. So yeah, condemned and burned at the stake as a witch. And a heretic means somebody who is teaching against the church.